So I think we've nearly got a full contingent. This is great. And I think that is a reflection of your work, Tamara, that it's really important, that it's an area that we all know New Zealand is on a journey to build better. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to the expert. So Tamara is a transport planner and PhD candidate at Auckland University of Technology. She's interested in urban systems design retrofit, supporting low carbon transport, equity of access for people of all ages and abilities, public health and livability. Tamara has just submitted her PhD thesis, in which she examined the barriers to walking from the perspectives of people, technical guidelines, and professionals. So last piece of housekeeping, if you have questions, please throw them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end after Tamara's presentation. So over to you, Tamara.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Freda, for the invitation into IPWEA. I'll just share my screen. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to share the findings, and I think that the job that you do, Freda, in connecting the community is very important. So I would like to acknowledge my PhD supervisors, Professor Erica Hinton, Associate Professor Melody Smith, and Dr. Tom Stewart, who might be in the audience. So another word about me. I do come from a technical background. I'm a transport planner and civil engineer specialized in transport planning, but I was always really interested in how transport planning contributes to places where we want to live in and places where transport can be carbon neutral and places are inclusive. So I worked for 14 years in Europe, Argentina, now New Zealand. And living in Auckland, I really had this question of, okay, we have this really car-dominated environment that Jan Gehl called the peak hour traffic machine. And how do we get from there to a place where people choose to walk, take public transport and cycle, as the regional land transport plan says, for instance, or how do we get to carbon neutral systems? So it's really, there seems to be this massive gap. And how do we cross this gap? And I was really interested in walking as our primary mode of transport that should be accessible to everyone in theory, and that has maybe had less focus both from the research and the practice. There is a lot about bicycle, for instance, which is great, but I think walking has been a bit the poor parent. So you might have heard, and we do hear that quite often, that maybe Aucklanders don't walk, or New Zealanders don't walk, or Australians don't walk. And I think it's just useful to just remember the potentials that we have. So for instance, in Auckland, as in the rest of New Zealand, a quarter of the trips driven are less than 1 kilometer. And in Auckland, we have 41% people who say that they would like to walk more, but the daily walking is less than 450 meters. So I think it would be a bit easy and a bit of a damageable shortcut just to say that, well, we are a car-dominated city, people don't walk, and it just can't happen. I think we have a lot of potential. So for walking to happen, we know that we need destinations and people close to destinations, and the intensification of the city and the densification is an ongoing process that is absolutely necessary and that absolutely needs to continue. And here on the right, we do have some destinations. My focus was rather on what we can do today and tomorrow, and also coming from a transport planning practice. So I'm looking at the street environment, and I'm looking at how the street environments associate with people's experience of walking, what might be perceived as difficult or challenging. And I'm also looking at who is not even here, who did not even try to cross that street because of some difficulty they experienced. Maybe they stayed home, maybe they are in this black car there and doing a short trip. So working as a transport planner, I thought that this is the kind of questions that we don't address enough, and we don't have enough evidence on. So I set on doing a PhD on that topic. So my problem and the million-dollar question I had in mind starting this is really, if we decided that we want to retrofit the environment, if we decided that we want to improve the streets, what should we do? Where should we start? Where should we put the first dollar and the first $1 million and the first $100 million? So that was really the question that led the work. And yeah, so to answer this question, the PhD included different studies. And so I first looked at the theoretical model. How does environment link to walking behavior? Then what is missing in this slide, we look at quantitatively what barriers or motivations are associated with Aucklanders' walking levels. And then the core of the work was really looking at the barriers to walking. What do people perceive as being barriers? How does it vary between disabled and non-disabled people? Because equity is really important, and disability was a lens that I thought needed to be examined. How can we measure and characterize those barriers? And a reality check of the guidelines. Do the guidelines we have allow us to identify those barriers? And the last study I did was engaging with professionals in charge of delivering walking environments in public health and looking at what they see as priorities, challenges, and barriers, and to what extent they agree and disagree on the way forward. So first, very briefly, I won't enter into the detail of the model. This is just a summary overview, but just as a theoretical framing, what we name the social model of walkability links the walking environment, so destinations, the street design, and the transport system to walking behavior. But in the middle, there is this think, and our human perceptions. It's really how people perceive walkability and how people perceive that their walking needs are being met. And so it's a hierarchy from the most basic, being walking is feasible, to more sophisticated perceptions such as I enjoy this walk, or I think that it's in line with my ethics. And we will have individual, social, and trip-related characteristics that will influence all of those relationships. Then why Aucklanders walk or don't walk? So we looked at the data from the Auckland Transport Active Mode Survey. So that survey is really extremely useful because it has a lot of, there are a lot of respondents, and people answer to a whole range of questions about the barriers they might have or not, and the motivations they might have to walk. And we have some demographic data. So it's only non-disabled people, unfortunately. I think that's quite a serious caveat in this data set. But beside that, we use this data and we use machine learning to really answer the question of how can we predict walking levels based on what people perceive as barriers or motivations and their characteristics, and if so, what matters? That was a really interesting investigation for me, because many of the usual suspects were actually found not guilty. So having destinations available nearby did not have a lot of signal in the model. Motivation such as I walk because of fitness or similar did not have signal, or I don't walk because of hills or weather did not have signal. So that's really interesting, because that's the kind of thing that we can hear as the reasons why, well, it's not a thing. There was one key aspect, that was one key variable that helped us predict walking levels, and that was really the broader transport system. the use of public transport came as the #1 predictor of walking levels. And when we dug deeper into the reasons for users and non-users of public transport to walk, it was really implicitly we could understand that it's really variables that compare walking to other modes. So I walk when it's more convenient than, or cheaper than, or because I don't have a choice, and I might have used the choice if I did have one. So that was a very important addition to the model, saying, well, we really need to integrate the transport system as a entry variable in our model. Then I interviewed people. I interviewed 56 people, half of whom were disabled. And I really wanted to discuss with them what are the barriers they perceive. So with each person, we looked at what are the places they go to, and for each of their usual trips, what can be elements that they struggle with. And I had them describe where this thing is and why this, what the issue is. And we also looked at destinations that they perceive as being in walkable distance and where they would like to walk to, but where they don't walk to. And again, I try to understand why this is. So this was very rich data on people's views and inputs and specific places, saying, well, I struggle with this intersection here. And all the barriers that people reported as preventing them from walking to their destinations, those barriers were then objectively characterized. We had a whole set of metrics to measure each type of barriers, and then we measured all of those barriers. So this was really an amazing material to work with. And I wanted to show you a video that was made with some of the participants' quotes and showing the places that they struggle with and participants' quotes. And unfortunately, we had a issue where the video plays, but the sound does not play. So we will send, this is the link, and we will send the link later on. It's just a 6-minute video, but it was done by a documentary maker, and I'm really happy with the results. And I think it does illustrate the views of diverse people, disabled and non-disabled. But for now, I will just skip on that, and I will just talk to the results. So it was really interesting to compare disabled and non-disabled people, because across the board, everyone struggled in one way or another with traffic and traffic-related infrastructure. And I think that's a really important point for us, especially transport planners. So it's really, transport is supposed to connect people and to allow people to function. And when we look at walking, transport might be actually a barrier to accessing destinations or opportunities. And it was interesting to know differences between disabled and non-disabled people. Disabled people tended to really report on the most basic needs not being met: feasibility, accessibility, sometimes safety. And each of the disabled participants, it was really obvious that they had a whole range of tactics and strategies for getting around. But even those sophisticated strategies did not allow them to travel spontaneously. For instance, blind participants typically will memorize their usual trips and will be wary of doing trips that are unfamiliar because of inconsistencies of design that might just put them in danger or be non-navigable. So that was extremely interesting. And having had those inputs from people and having measured each of those barriers, for instance, non-signalized crossings were barriers. And so I was able to measure, okay, what characterizes those non-signalized crossings where people struggle. So that was a great source of, that was great material that allowed us to sort of reality check guidelines. So I took local guidelines, Auckland Transport Design Manual and the Walkability Pedestrian Design Guide, and also the Healthy Streets Indicators as best practice. And I really wondered, well, would those documents allow us to identify those places that people struggle with? And the answer was actually not really. Many of those places would have been missed by the thresholds and indications given in the guidelines in Healthy Streets. And I think there are three main reasons for that. There is a lack of nuance, typically not taking into account holistic environments, but looking at one aspect. For instance, traffic needs to be lower than X. It's actually more complicated. Yes, traffic should be lower than X, but if traffic is low and on the other hand, speed or visibility speed is high or visibility is low, well, low traffic might just not be a sufficient indicator. Guidelines tend not to be specific enough, typically not to give thresholds that allow us to scan the network, finding those complicated places. And in their in the way they are framed, the guidelines and the best practice look at the what would be ideally walkable. And this is a noble aim, but I think that the problem with this is that right now we are so far from this that I think that we need tools that really help us identify the worst of, help us identify those things that we should start with today and tomorrow and the day after. And maybe in some time we can think about what would be ideal, but right now we really need to focus on what is just absolutely not walkable. And the last study we did was engage with professionals. So we had 28 experts involved in either the design and delivery of walkable environments or public health. And with the professionals, we talked about user experiences, how they see users' experience, how they see barriers that people face, how they see priorities and challenges to improving the car-oriented city, and how the evidence look like. What evidence do they use? What evidence gaps we might have? And we looked at the agreements and disagreements. So the professionals first completed an anonymous online survey, and with the findings of this survey, we had a focus group to drill deeper into aspects that were not consensual, or challenges that were identified as challenges, but to try to understand better how we could overcome them. So there were 5 in this idea of transforming the car-centric city. There were some key challenges that were identified through this study. First, the systemic complexity. As seen in the previous studies, walking cannot be considered in a vacuum. It's really, people will compare it with other modes, and the attractiveness of other modes might impede on or degrade the quality for walking. We identified car-centric policies, governance, technical practices, which means that more of the same is getting delivered. We have the car-oriented city, and we're delivering more car-oriented city, which is a huge issue. There is an obvious lack of both interest and data regarding user experiences, people's experiences. It's, for instance, not a metric that is used in decision-making. Decision-making will look at benefit-cost ratio. Projects will not be funded because they improve people's experiences. It's just not a metric. And the focus group identified a very interesting vicious circle linking policy, how we engage with people, what we deliver, how we understand user experience, the lack of overview of barriers, and a continuation of policies delivering more of the same and not taking into account user experiences. And lastly, the challenge for transforming the city is there were a lot of disagreements between professionals of different disciplines who in an ideal world should collaborate. Namely, there were disagreements around how well we understand users, people's needs or not. And there were also disagreements on what barriers people experience and what we should focus on, which is a problem, because if we are to do something in a concerted way tomorrow, we should agree on what this is. So just as a wrap up, systemic barriers to walking exist, and retrofit is necessary, and it will benefit everyone, but the highest stakes are for disabled people who for now are discriminated against by the design of the system. We need better data and specific insights, and those can help us prioritize interventions. Those can help us literally scan our networks and find those places that might be challenging for people. And we need for multidisciplinary system approach. I think we see time and time again siloed approaches, urban design on one side, transport planning, public health, social inclusion, and those cannot work the ones without the others, or even within the transport system. We have public transport and walking and cycling. They're disconnected, and they really need to talk to each other. So this was me. Takeaway for practice. I think that 3 main takeaways. Guidelines we need specific guidelines that help us identify the worst off, to be able to identify them and address them, those barriers. Practice should team up with academia to better understand the needs of diverse people and better understand what the experience barriers relate to. I think these findings should be considered to prioritize retrofit. And I think we have a lot of learnings from the initiatives such as Innovative Streets. We have a lot to learn from there, and we can apply it in prioritizing retrofit of the existing barriers. So this was me. Thank you for your attention. There is, just need to mention, there is a technical report that that was released based on the findings. So I know that no one will read the thesis, but there is a technical report with just specific elements that might help you in your work. So this is a short link that we will also send. And I'm happy to answer questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamara. That's fascinating. I've been scrolling down a few notes. So everyone, you're welcome to throw questions into the chat. I'm not sure if you can see them, Tamara, but there is one from Bridget Burdett. Yes. So I can read it out for everyone. Yep. Or would you like to read it out?
Yeah. Question for Tamara. You talk about knowing what the best next step is, what to fix first. In terms of broken system of transport investment, what is your ideal next step? Where should those of us interested in system change direct our efforts? Talk to leaders, do the research, do a partner with community, or something else? This is a great question, Bridget, and I know Bridget very well. I think that in this vicious circle, this circle needs to be cut somewhere. And ideally, well, each of the points perpetuate the circle, but I think we should act where we can. We should, as technical professionals, we should bring the evidence in the project around experience. We should challenge the way investment is allocated. I think it's really the perpetuation of the system that is challenging, and I think that there is a lack of awareness that it is even a problem. So I think that if as professionals we raise those issues, and we raise the issues of how our system is funded and how the funding is allocated, that would be extremely useful. And I think that there is also a lot of work we can do with the research to really gather this evidence, because at some point, as technical staff, we don't have the power of take or making the funding decisions. But I'm counting on the moment where the tide will turn and where there will be a will to fund an improvement. And at that point, we need to have put out there the evidence that allows to operationalize it. We need to have a plan ready. And I think that we have tools for having the plan ready. And the moment where the dollars are allocated, use this plan. Because we can see so many decisions being taken left, right, and center. And really, it bothers me that there is no evidence that funding goes to the highest needs. So sorry, long answer, but I hope it provided some elements.
I think that was a great answer. There is another question from a couple of questions. Shall I just let you go through them now that I've
Yeah. So George Week said, people's tendency to walk and its determination by public transport use is really an interesting finding. It's also convenient to listen with studies from overseas. Public transport is such a crucial part of the transport system, but it has to be paired with an accessible walking environment. Are you going to be able to present your findings to Auckland Transport ELT board? It would be a good to raise the understanding of this extent, to the extent to which the walking environment is part of the transport system. Yeah, thank you, George. So yes, I will be presenting this at the Auckland Transport Active Modes Community of Practice on 21st of September, if I'm right. And I did this technical report precisely to try to have the findings out there, and I'm really happy to. The purpose of my PhD was really to bring back to the practice those kinds of insights that can help us take better decisions. So I'm really happy to share the findings. So if there are other contexts or platforms or opportunities, I'm really keen to do that. But yes, Auckland Transport obviously is a important stakeholder, and yeah, the findings were sent.
Tamara, I was just going to say, can you unshare your screen so that we can see everyone?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
No, it doesn't make a huge difference, but it's good to see a beautiful community in this lovely connecting social place of our screens. So a couple more really great questions. Should I read those out for you?
Oh yeah, great.
We just keep questioning you till you need a break. I think this is just an indication that this conversation is so important. So Michael Bridge asks, have you measured NUX, non-user experiences, right? Discovering why they don't make any trips by foot, and further, what measures can we take to support behavior change?
Yes, absolutely. So in the interviews, that was a really important part of the interviews, actually, was asking people, what are those places that you would like to go to and where you don't? So I'm really speaking with people of places they know and environments they know, and looking at what are those barriers that that cause them not to walk. And so those were the barriers that we identified as critical features. There were 6 of them. Non-signalized crossings were for instance, part of them. So that was really a key aspect. And then all the barriers that were measured were based on this. So those 6 types of barriers that might prevent people from walking trips, those are the ones that then I went to measure and informed through specific metrics. So for instance, non-signalized crossings, there was traffic, and I identified the importance of cornering radii and complexity. And there are we drafted some specific thresholds: traffic above X and radii above X and complexity above X. At least some people might struggle. So yeah, that's a great point, and that's exactly what we try to do. And the good point is that we can. There are ways of specifically identifying those places, which means that we can then scan our networks and we can have a heat map of what are the places people might struggle with? And then if we overlay this heat map with the heat map of what are the places where there are potentials for people of going between a neighborhood and a school or a neighborhood and a shop, then we have our prioritization plan ready. We have identified places that are difficult and that are in the way of people wanting to get from A to B. So yeah, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and solid. Data already exists in your approach there. Lots of questions. So I'll just keep going through. We've just got 3 waiting. So I see Alex has got one. I'll just go in order. So Grant Holland asks, hi Tamara, great to see what you've learned. Doesn't seem that long since we were discussing your PhD topic. Okay, well done. Did you find the engagement between disability sectors and, how did you find the engagement between disability sectors and professionals? I think you've already touched on that a bit.
Yeah, there are a few interesting points. I heard from both the disability sector and researchers a bit of fatigue. Disabled people tend to be a bit tired of being interviewed again and again and asked about what they struggle with, but then nothing changes. And I think this is an extremely important point. So I was really very conscious of that starting, and I really wanted to, it was really my mission to make something useful out of what people say. So I think that this is a key important point. So engagement tends to be a bit of a box ticking. And I think that this is really harmful. We need good evidence, and we need transparency in evidence that we collect and what we do with it and how it helps us improve the environments, and not keep asking people the same questions. So yeah. Thank you, Grant. And yeah, I also remember chatting with you, and it was not very long ago.
That is interesting. Yeah, you've talked a lot about evidence, so I'm definitely interested to to share your work further, to continue to do so. And we have a question from C. Graham. Sorry, I don't know what the C stands for. Thanks, Tamara. He asks, they ask, sorry, do you know of any case studies in New Zealand or elsewhere where a strong focus on retrofitting a specific community area for walking has been completely funded and then measured? I feel like strengths in an approach like this would be local knowledge and community street audits.
Absolutely. And what comes to mind first is really the Innovative Streets initiative funded by Wakakotahi. And we have a lot of projects, and Wakakotahi has really insisted rightly on those projects being co-designed with the local people and measured and informed. And this is a huge source of information. And I'm a very big fan of tactical urbanism as a way of both letting people experience environments that are designed differently, but also for us to learn how behaviors change, but also how people's perceptions change. So I think this is a huge piece of information. And the idea, in the idea of collecting better evidence, I think that those projects should absolutely inform the evidence, but we should have a central source of evidence. And when I interviewed professionals, I asked them, if you had to make the case for needs for walking in Auckland, what would you use? And the responses were all over the place. So that's a problem. And some people use guidelines, and some people use international documents, and so which really makes me think we don't have one obvious source of evidence speaking of what local people struggle with or need, or what improves the experiences. So yeah, but we do have projects that would definitely help build, or that have already elements of that evidence.
I hear this so much that we need more cross-agency and multidisciplinary collaboration and a source that everyone can access. So there is a very strong argument for it, and I'm really hopeful that we start to action things in that space for sure. There's a continuation of that question. Can you expand a bit more on what you meant by the key takeaway, developing guidance by identifying the worst of, and what would you do in that case?
Yeah, so it's really, so that's the work that I've started here. It's really finding what do people struggle with, measuring it, and being able to characterize it. So for instance, you will see it in the technical report. People struggle with non-signalized crossings, but we were specific about those are the types of non-signalized, because I know that it's not helpful if I say non-signalized crossings because we have 3 zillions of them. But we need to make sure, we need to be specific with what are those non-signalized crossings that people struggle with. And we identify that crossings where the radius is, for instance, open. And even though you don't have many people turning, you have the risk of someone turning and arriving at you at speed, or the complexity, the number of movements of traffic that you need to watch. So that's what I meant. We need tools that help us identify those places that people might struggle with, and those tools will say things like crossings that have speeds or radii higher than X, and that have complexity higher than X, and that have traffic higher than X, and how these things combine. Those are the places that you should focus on. For now, we don't have that. We have guidelines that say we need crossings, and we need trees, and we need benches, and we need footpaths, and all those are correct and right and appropriate. But it's a huge long list from which we are very far from right now. So I hope it answered better the question.
And I think at least it's going to be injecting a little bit of inspiration and motivation into us all. And it's only 11:10, so I'll just invite a few more questions. Alex, would you like to? I'll just unmute. Yeah.
Kia ora. Thanks, Tamara. I am really interested as well in reducing the barriers to change, like you're touching on with tactical urbanism, and have been really inspired by, I think many of us have been, by the NPSUD on urban development for spatial planning, and namely, of course, the removal of parking minimums and walking catchments, etc. So I'm wondering if you foresee some sort of influential policy changes that can, I don't know, work behind the scenes that elevate the level of change that are influential on that, in a similar vein, so that all of this stuff is just part of the course problem solving, and we don't face the same level of pushback that projects do currently. Yeah,
I think firstly we need to bridge this disconnect that we have right now between the wider policy goals being accessibility, climate change, equity. So we have those big goals, and then we decide on fundings based on something else. So that would be really the first step of, okay, we have those goals, and then we have some kind of logical continuation of this is what we aim for, and therefore this is what we deliver, and this is how this responds to those. So that's something that we don't have for now, and I think it's really harmful, because we decide based on benefit cost ratios, and then we have those goals, but those goals are not going to get realized out of themselves. We need to be proactive about implementing projects that deliver against those goals. And the second, you mentioned parking minima, and I think that's the other thing that that we really need, is to have a better integration between within the transport system, not consider walking as one thing and parking and public transport and cycling, but really consider the system as a whole. For instance, having objectives such as Wellington city center. We have what is the modal share? What is the modal share that we want to achieve? Therefore, what is the global approach that we are taking to reducing parking, improving public transport, improving walking connections, etc., in a consistent and cohesive way. So, yeah, change. And I see the difficulty, and I see the difficulty of the both systemic complexity and this entrenched car-oriented focus. But I think that it's really something that you as advocates and us as professionals need to challenge. And I'm very happy to have met you. We have been following each other on Twitter, and it's great to see you in real life.
Yes, congratulations on your PhD.
Thank you.
Huge achievement. Yeah, yeah. I've got another question here from Stuart Croswell. Hi, Tamara. Do you know, and you might have touched on this a little bit, do you know if Waka Kotahi will be using this type of insight and level of service standards defined in the One Network framework? And he just says, I think this would be an important part of breaking the cycle.
Yeah, I don't. So I used to work for Waka Kotahi. That was 3 years ago. And I remember being pulled into the One Network road classification discussions and bringing the aspect of link in place. So to answer shortly, I do not know what Waka Kotahi will do, but I think that it's absolutely crucial that this happens. So I think that it's absolutely crucial that I know that the pedestrian design guide is being reviewed now, and I think that we really need this broader approach of not only focusing on walking, but really focusing on streets and having this conversation on what are the roles of those streets. Because here, it was especially shocking for me arriving in New Zealand from Switzerland, is my home base. And in New Zealand, we have this thing where we have in theory a road classification that's on the paper, that's on the web. But then when we're on the streets, a lot of streets just look the same. And who knows what's an arterial or a collector? You can turn left, right, and center everywhere. Everything is wide. You can probably drive 60 everywhere quite comfortably. So that's really a huge issue on the classification we have in theory not being translated on the ground. And I'm thinking that on the ground, we really need those conversations on what is the purpose of this street? If the purpose of this street is access, we don't need 4-meter wide lanes. We don't need 10-meter turning radii. We don't need X, Y, Z. That's the kind of conversation that we really, I think, need to have and need to push as professionals and as advocates.
Hmm. Yeah, I know. I'm sure everyone here has, lived in different countries, and when you have those different experiences and you see how it can be, it's sort of when you talk about the contrast between that tactical sort of having your perceptions shifted, like the behavior change needs a perception change first, and so having those experiences is so valuable. So it can be hard to come back here. And
yeah.
And
we need political courage. I think that's a bit of the elephant in the room. And and I often think of this quote. Ford said that if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Yeah. We need a bit of vision and political courage, and we need accountability when we say that we want a society that is equitable and inclusive, and that we want a carbon neutral transport system. We need to be accountable. We need to deliver against that. And for now, I don't see much of that. The budget, the three-year transport budget was approved 2 days ago. So it's 6 billion for walking, cycling, public transport together, which I'm waiting to see what will go to walking, but it also means that 75% of the budget perpetuates what we have. So it is a problem. And maybe going forward, we might have a budget that is for streets and environments and not specific to modes, because it's really about redesigning our environments, and we're not speaking of designing a footpath or separately designing a bus line or separately designing a carriageway. It's all part of street environments that we need to take holistically.
Ruth has asked, thank you for a great presentation. How would you see a more centralized database working, and what types of data would be most useful to centralize? And I think you've touched on that quite a bit.
Yeah. We need to avoid the issue of making something that is just huge and not usable. But I think we really need specifics of diverse people. And for instance, in my research, I interviewed 56 people, which is a lot, but also it's not a lot, because it was hard to interview sufficient, for instance, numbers of people having different disabilities and using different mobility devices. And this is really just the kind of work that needs to, so we need evidence from more people, and we just need to have a simple overview of what people struggle with, meaning by that what at least some people might struggle with. So that's the kind of work, and that's the insights I've given in the technical report. So I've given results from each of the studies, and then after each, I really try to put bullet point takeaways. So I think that could help with that work. But really, we need to consider diversity. And for instance, I had blind participants, but I had blind participants using a cane or using a blind dog. And it's just, they will have different needs. And we might even just have this notion of disabled people. They are a diverse group. We need to understand what diverse people within this group might struggle with and address those things.
Yeah, great answer. Paul asks, Paul Strange, will parking minimums being dropped just create more pressure on the roadside parking, the same space we want to make better for cyclists and pedestrians? How do we change the mindset on car ownership? Big one.
Yeah, that is a big one. And I think we need system change. It's not only cutting the access by car, it's simultaneously reducing the attractiveness of cars, improving attractiveness of public transport, improving the accessibility of public transport. And that's something that can happen typically sector by sector. If we have those conversations on, this is our village center, how do we want people to access? Okay, if we want more people on public transport, what is, and walking and cycling, what is the kind of space that we give them? What is, maybe we will have parking that is a bit further away, etc., etc. It's the kind of conversations that we need to have holistically, because if we have them in a vacuum, then I can understand people. I can understand why people drive here. People drive mainly because it's more convenient, or because there are no other options. So I can totally understand the outrage saying, well, no, you can't drive anymore. So it's really this shifting the mindset, saying, okay, well, this place is going to change, and this is how we are going to evolve it. And it's not only we are going to cut the only access that you're using now, but implementing this really holistical change, saying, well, okay, people come from this destination, we're going to have better public transport, and we're going to have this public transport more accessible, and therefore in this corridor we're going to have less amenity for driving, for instance.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. And I think it all keeps coming back to political courage, like you say, that there are some people missing from this conversation, that it's not like we're going to them with a simple, can you do this, please, Minister? It is giving them the evidence and the argument for the deals that they're going to go in and make with the other ministers, and cutting Treasury out and just actually being like, so this is public health, this is, you know, all the things that you've talked about.
But the great news is that New Zealand, it's not something that New Zealand is inventing or needs to invent.
I was going to ask international best practice.
Yeah,
or,
and we have so much of that because around the world, from the 50s onwards, planning has been massively car-oriented. And in the last 20 years, there has been a really significant change. Look at New York, for instance, having improved road safety and increased the amenity and increased the attractiveness of the street and the usage of this street. Look at, I did a study trip in Seattle, Vancouver, San Francisco, and Portland, and looked at those environments that are comparable in that they were built in the same eras that most of New Zealand's urban environments were built, but those cities were really progressive in how they transformed those environments. And there were some really amazing findings. I went to look at what they did. I went to look at their policies. I went to speak with their both transport planners, urban designers, decision makers. There is heaps we can learn from that. So yeah, it's not something that we are. It is a complex task, but I think that we have a lot of evidence available out there.
Yeah, so we don't have to build it ourselves.
No.
Yeah, there's no more questions at the moment. If anyone does have any more, please post them in. We're nearly at 10:30. Yeah, I think what I will say is it's kind of a plug, I suppose, but in March next year, we have our RIMS, it's our Road Infrastructure Management Support Conference or Forum. And so the theme of that is the carbon equation. So it would be amazing to have you there. I can send information through. And the other little plug is that my next thought leadership session is a wonderful woman who's just published her first book called Our Untold Future. And she was actually once an urban planner. She's also New Zealand's Poetry Jam champion. And the title of her webinar is The Power of Story to Build Better Systems or to Build Better. So yeah, just a little plug. That one, I feel like it just overlaps so much with what you've said. And I hope that we all keep talking. I'd like to keep in touch with you, Tara. And Grant has said, yep, RIMS will be great. So we see him there every year. Yeah. So is there any last comments that you wanted to share, Tamara?
No, I just wanted to thank you again for the invite, and thank you all for having participated and for the great questions. I think we had a great chat, and yeah, just know that I'm available. I really encourage you to go check the video where you will see participants, what these places that people struggle with and their words, and the technical report. And do reach out if I can help you specifically with what you are doing. I think that we really need to team up towards this change.
Excellent. Yeah, I think what would feel good out of something like this is that it's not just a conversation that just stops. Where one thing that we can do is we're part of a massive ecosystem, and with our small size, what we do have is the willingness to be a vehicle and a platform for all the thought, the expertise that's out there with people such as yourself. So I'd love to just support any ways that we can, yeah, keep the conversations going and make the influence where it's needed, and grow that political courage.
Yeah,
So
I would just like to mention, oh, sorry. I would just like to mention as a plug that we started a series of conferences about transition, and it's really transitioning towards carbon neutrality. And Wahakutahi is supporting those conferences, so it's maybe something that could interest people present here. And it's really about the how. We know that we need to. We know that we need to transition. It's really how and addressing this systemic change. So yeah, I encourage you to check it out.
Let us know how your defense goes, and yeah, we will be in touch. Yeah, thank you so much for the inspiration.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Excellent.
day.